Good day, everyone. We are Group 3 of BSN 4C, and today we will be presenting the life of Dr. Jose Rizal with a focus on his final days, trial, and death. To begin, let us first look at the historical context surrounding Rizal's execution. So during the late 19th century, the Philippines was under the Spanish colonial rule. At the time, Filipino society was heavily oppressed by the colonial government and the friars, who held immense power over the government and religion. Social injustices, discrimination, and lack of representation pushed many Filipinos to call for reform. Jose Rizal emerged as one of the most influential voices of reform. Through his writings, particularly the Lonlime Tangere and El Filibusterismo, he exposed the abuses of the Spanish friars and government officials. His ideas awakened Filipino nationalism and inspired both reformists and revolutionaries. Although Rizal consistently advocated for peaceful reform rather than armed rebellion, his influence on the people made him a perceived threat to the Spanish authorities. As the Philippine Revolution broke out in 1896 under the Katipunan, Rizal was accused of being one of its masterminds. Despite his denials, his reputation as the intellectual leader of the Filipino people led Spain to treat him as a dangerous enemy. Thus, by the end of 1896, Spanish authorities decided to make an example of him. His arrest, trial, and eventual death sentence were meant to silence the growing nationalist movement. However, instead of crushing the spirit of the Filipinos, Rizal's martyrdom only fueled their determination to fight for freedom.
So, with Rizal's arrest and charges, it began when Rizal returned from Europe on June 26, 1892, and founded La Liga Filipina 1 month after his arrival. 4 days after the founding, he was arrested on the grounds of publishing anti-friar books, the possession of Pobres Frailes, which is a handbill that violated Spanish orders, dedicating El Filibusterismo to the traitors Gomburza and promoting the idea that the Philippines will only be saved by independence from Spain, and finally criticizing Catholicism and pushing the idea that it must be separated from the Filipino people. With that, Rizal was exiled to Dapitan for 4 years. At the end of his exile, he made plans to transfer to Cuba to work as a physician for the Spanish Empire to get into their good graces, and rowed a boat to Spain on August 6, 1886. Unfortunately, the Philippine Revolution had already begun by this time and was in full swing. Because of that, when Rizal arrived in Spain, he was arrested and brought back to the Philippines on November 3, 1986. A few days later, on November 20, 1886, Rizal was placed in front of a military tribunal in Fort Santiago, where the prosecution used oral testimonies to implicate Rizal's involvement in the revolution. Because it is a military tribunal, Rizal was only allowed to pick a military official to be his lawyer, and out of a list of 106 names, he chose his close friend, Lieutenant Luis Taviel de Andrade. Governor Blanco, who was presiding over Rizal's arrest at this time and the proceedings, forwarded the case to Governor General Camilo de Polavieja. Rizal's actual trial began on December 26, 1886, where Rizal was charged with rebellion, sedition, and conspiracy, specifically por rebelión, sedición y asociación ilícita, against the Spanish colonial government in the Philippines. Because he was a writer, Rizal presented 12 arguments against the accusations. Unfortunately, the military court deemed Rizal guilty of all charges and voted for the death penalty, where on December 28th, 2 days later, 1886, Governor General Polavieja signed Rizal's death warrant. Rizal himself signed the letter, stating that he was innocent.
So let's talk about Rizal's prison life in Fort Santiago. He was kept in a privileged single cell in the fort's barracks and was allowed visitors and family time. On the 29th of December, his mother and several sisters came to say farewell. He also had several conversations with Jesuit priests whose names were Fathers Villatlara, March, and also Vicente Balaguer. They visited him repeatedly from December 29 and December 30 to administer religious rites and offer counsel. He also spent much of his confinement reading, annotating, receiving visitors, and also writing both to defend himself in court and to compose personal letters and short statements. Now, one of these writings included Manifesto a Algunos Filipinos, otherwise translated to Manifesto to Certain Filipinos, which was written on December 15, 1896. It was a short statement addressed to Filipinos in which Rizal attempted to explain his position and claimed that he did not intend to lead an armed revolution. Now, he also wrote last letters to his friends and family from December 29 to December 30, 1896. In his final 48 hours, he wrote brief farewell notes and letters in which he calmly states he will be executed the next morning, but insists on his innocence of leading the rebellion. He also addressed letters to his brother Pasiano and family members asking forgiveness and giving final instructions. Finally, and most notably, he wrote Me Ultimo Adios, translated to My Last Farewell, composed in his cell on December 29, 1896. On the eve of his execution, he finished a 14-stanza, 5-line stanza poem in Spanish. He did not sign or title it, and the document was later given the title by his own friends and publishers. This poem expresses love of his country, acceptance of death, hope for the nation, and the wish that his death would serve as a sacrifice.
On December 13, 1896, Jose Rizal was marched from his cell in Fort Santiago to Bagumbayan, which we now call Luneta. He was surrounded by a heavy escort of Spanish soldiers, a clear symbol of how threatening the colonial government considered him, even in the face of death. But despite this intimidating scene, Rizal's demeanor remained calm, dignified, and fearless. He walked serenely, showing acceptance of his faith and courage that inspired everyone who witnessed it. This moment was not just a walk to his execution, it was the final act that highlighted his unshakable principles. By meeting death with such composure, Rizal was transformed from an ordinary man into a true martyr for Philippine independence. His calmness symbolized peaceful resistance, showing us that while the Spaniards could silence his body, they could never silence his spirit and his ideals. Even today, Rizal's walk to execution teaches us important lessons. The true strength is found in conviction, that ideas are more powerful than weapons, and that love for our country means being willing to sacrifice for the greater good. His final steps continue to inspire us Filipinos to stand firm in our values and never lose hope in the pursuit of freedom and
Now,
justice.
we will have the execution at Bagumbayan, now called Luneta. On the morning of December 30, 1896, at exactly 7 a.m., the air of Bagumbayan was filled with silence and sorrow, for it was the day that the nation witnessed the death of Dr. Jose Rizal. His execution by a firing squad was not merely the death of a man, but the birth of a martyr whose words and action continued to inspire generations. The site of Rizal's execution was Bagumbayan Field, which means New Town. Under Spanish rule, Bagumbayan was the usual place where political prisoners were executed publicly, ensuring that the crowds could witness and be disciplined through fear. Rizal's demeanor and words. On his final walk, Rizal showed composure and quiet dignity. He refused to be blindfolded or handcuffed, wishing to face death freely with open eyes. Accounts differ about his last words, but some recall him whispering, Consummatum is, Latin for it is finished. His calmness transformed the execution from a punishment into a moment of martyrdom, as he displayed courage and serenity in the face of death. Method of execution. Rizal was executed by a firing squad composed of 12 Filipino soldiers who were forced to shoot under Spanish command. Behind them, Spanish soldiers stood ready to kill any Filipino soldier who dared to disobey these orders. The method was chosen because it was public and humiliating, intended to portray Rizal as a traitor and display the power of Spain over the Filipino people. Now we will have the final moments, turning to face the sun. When the rifles were fired, Rizal's body was struck, but with one last effort, he twisted so that he fell facing the rising sun instead of lying on his back. This action carried deep symbolic meaning. Turning to the sun represented hope, enlightenment, and his unwavering belief in the awakening of the Filipino nation. Literary and symbolic insights. Bagong Bayan as a stage. The field becomes a stage where history transforms into literature, a dramatic climax in the story of the nation. Execution by Filipino under Spanish command symbolizes a divided people but also foreshadow eventual unity. Turning to the sun, a literary image of hope and eternal light, Rizal's final gesture transforms death into transcendence.
Hello, I'm Chelsea Villavenda. I will be discussing the reactions of the people towards Rizal's death. When Rizal was executed on December 30, 1896, the news was met with deep sorrow and anger among Filipinos. Many mourned his death as a national tragedy. Accounts of his final hours preserved by the Filipinas Heritage Library show how family and friends were filled with grief while Rizal himself remained calm and composed, writing letters and his famous farewell poem Ultimo Adios before facing the firing squad. His execution shocked the population and quickly spread across the country. Funeral processions and gatherings became venues for expressing sorrow, and Rizal's martyrdom elevated him as a symbol of the nation's struggle. International reports also recognized this with accounts describing how the world mourned the loss of a great reformist intellectual. Alongside grief, Filipinos also felt outrage towards the Spanish colonial authorities. The trial that condemned Rizal was widely seen as unjust, and his death was perceived as a brutal attempt to silence reformist voices. Newspapers like La Voz Española and El Diario de Manila cited the research of historian Rene Escalante, acknowledged both his bravery and controversy surrounding the retraction letter, but many Filipinos dismissed Spanish accounts as a propaganda. For ordinary Filipinos, his execution intensified resentment toward colonial authorities, especially the clergy, and revealed the failure of peaceful reform to address injustices. The National Historical Commission of the Philippines, or NHCP, notes that the Rizal's death marked a turning point, convincing many reformists and intellectuals that peaceful change was no longer possible. Rizal's death also mobilized Filipinos into further revolutionary action. Only a day after his execution, uprisings like the Battle of Pateros erupted, showing how grief and anger translated into armed resistance. Revolutionary groups such as Katipunan drew inspiration from his martyrdom, and even some members of the El Estrado class who once favored reform pushed toward supporting the revolution. The NHCP highlights how his execution helped unify different factions, revolutionaries, reformists, and a broader population under a common cause against Spanish rule. On the other hand, the Spanish authorities' perspective toward his death, they view Rizal as a dangerous figure whose writings inspired rebellion. By the time of his arrest in 1896, the Philippine Revolution had already broken out, and authorities saw him as a potential leader of the movement. Even though Rizal denied involvement in the Katipunan uprising, Spanish officials accused him of the sedition, rebellion, and conspiracy. His trial, widely regarded as unjust, was meant to make an example out of him. According to historian Rene Escalante, the Spanish newspapers such as the La Voz Española and El Diario de Manila, which were mentioned earlier, reported on his trial and execution as a necessary act of justice, portraying Rizal as both a traitor and paradoxically as someone who met his death with dignity. The Spanish clergy, particularly the friars, were among the strongest voices pushing for Rizal's execution. They saw his novels No Limitangere and El Filibusterismo as direct attacks on the church, exposing corruption and abuses. Documents show that orders lobbied heavily for a death sentence, believing that sparing Rizal would embolden other reformists. The supposed retraction letter, published by the La Voz Española right after his death, was used by the authorities to claim that Rizal had reconciled with the church and renounced his criticisms, though many historians today doubt its authenticity. For the Spanish, this narrative helped portray Rizal's execution not as an act of oppression, but both as a punishment and a moral victory for the church. Overall, Spanish officials believed Rizal's death would suppress rebellion and discourage further resistance. However, the perspective underestimated the effect his martyrdom would have. Instead of silencing dissent, the execution intensified Filipino anger and strengthened the revolutionary cause. In hindsight, Spanish sources themselves later acknowledged that killing Rizal turned him into a powerful symbol of resistance rather than eliminating his influence.
So now I'm going to discuss Jose Rizal's burial and later transfer of remains. On December 30, 1896 at Paco Cemetery or Cementerio General de Paco, Manila, after Jose Rizal's execution at Bagong Bayan or now we call Luneta, his body was secretly buried by Spanish authorities. To prevent public veneration, the burial was done without honors, without a coffin, and with guards watching. So his remains were placed in an unmarked grave, later identified as number 107, near the wall of the cemetery. The Jesuits requested custody of his body but were denied. It was his elder sister, Narcisa Rizal, who located the grave by asking the cemetery caretaker and noticing the fresh earth and guards. She had grave marked with the initials RPJ or Rizal's initials in reverse to identify the spot. 2 years later, on August 17, 1898, after the fall of Spanish rule in Manila during the Philippine Revolution, Rizal's remains were exhumed from Paco Cemetery. His bones were placed inside an urn, which his family kept at their home in Binondo for safekeeping. On December 30, 1912, at the base of the Rizal Monument, Luneta, Manila, his remains were enshrined in a bronze urn made by sculptor Romualdo de Teodoro de Jesus, placed inside the base of the Rizal monument designed by Richard Kisley, a Swiss sculptor. The transfer was accompanied by a grand public ceremony, attended by thousands with full honors befitting a national hero.
So Rizal's execution on December 30, 1896, turned him into a martyr whose death intensified the Filipino struggle for freedom. Though he advocated peaceful reform over violent uprising, his unjust trial and execution by the Spanish authorities exposed the abuses of the colonial rule. His death stirred deep anger and grief among Filipinos, fueling the flames of the Philippine Revolution led by the Katipunan. Many revolutionaries drew inspiration from Rizal's writings and ultimate sacrifice, seeing his death as proof that independence was the only path to justice. Rizal's martyrdom elevated him to the status of the foremost national hero of the Philippines. His life and works embodied patriotism, intellectual brilliance, and moral courage. Unlike other leaders who fought mainly on the battlefield, Rizal used his pen to awaken Filipino consciousness and demand reforms. After his death, he became the symbol of unity, resistance, and the aspiration for nationhood. His execution transformed him from a reformist into the enduring icon of the Philippine independence, ensuring that his legacy would guide future generations in their quest for freedom and dignity.
Now let's move on to discussing Mi Ultimo Adios. So this was Rizal's final poem written on the eve of his execution. The poem was composed on December 29, 1896. It was among his final written works, and it is undated, untitled, and unsigned. So this poem was smuggled out by Rizal's family, and they played a key role in preserving the poem. The text was hidden in a small alcohol stove. Some sources may say lamp, but historians clarify it was a stove. And when Rizal was visited by his mother and sisters in the afternoon before his execution, he told his sister Trinidad in English, "There's something inside it," referring to the stove. The stove, with the hidden document, was handed to Narcisa, one of his other sisters, after the visit. After recovering the manuscript, the Rizal family made copies and sent them to friends in the Philippines and abroad. In 1897, it was first printed in Hong Kong by Mariano Ponce under the title Mi Ultimo Pensamiento, or My Last Thought. Later in 1898, Father Mariano de Canay published it in La Independencia with the name Mi Ultimo Adios, which is now the title commonly used.
Mi Ultimo Adios form and style. So, in form, the language is originally written in Spanish, and its structure includes a 14 stanza, which each with 5 lines, a quintet or a sequin. So, the rhyme scheme includes where Rizal used rhyme and rhythm typical of a romantic poetry written in Spanish literature, often following ABAAB patterns, though very flexible. The rhyme pattern is such that the last words of lines 1, 3, and 4 in each stanza rhyme together, and lines 2 and 5 rhyme with each other. So the meter is generally written in octosyllabic or 8-syllable lines, which is common in Spanish lyrical and patriotic poetry. So, in style, it is romantic and lyrical. It is full of imagery, emotions, and idealism. So, the elegiac tone, a farewell poem reflecting sacrifice, patriotism, and love for the Philippines. So, its symbolism include nature, such as the sunset, the dawn, the flowers, and the moonlight. It represents life, death, and hope. It uses nature imagery as reference to blood, martyrdom, country as beloved homeland, cross, death, etc. to the themes of sacrifice and nationhood. Personal yet universal, Rizal speaks as an individual facing death, but his message is for his country and its future generation. It combines a solemn farewell, patriotism, sacrifice, and hope. It is both elegiac and optimistic, where Rizal accepts his fate but expresses love for his country and belief in its future. So, for formal diction, he uses elevated, solemn language to give dignity to his sacrifice. In short, Mi Ultimo Adios is a Spanish romantic elegy structured as 14 quintets in octosyllabic verse with a lyrical and a patriotic style.
For the theme of Mi Ultimo Adios, Rizal shows us just how much he loved the Philippines. He says he's ready to offer his life with gladness, even if his homeland is sad and oppressed. For him, that is not just meaningless. It has value if it is for the country he loves. He even declares that it doesn't matter how or where he dies, whether on the scaffold, in the battlefield, or as a martyr, as long as it helps the Philippines. For Rizal, dying is not just the end of life. It is a way to give life back to the nation with his blood nourishing the land and his memory inspiring future generations. At the same time, Rizal shows his deep patriotism. He calls the Philippines the pearl of the Orient Sea, describing it as so beautiful and precious that it deserved his ultimate sacrifice. Since childhood, his dream was to see his homeland free from oppression and shame. But his patriotism is not only about himself, he also connects his sacrifice to others, for example, to the martyrs who died before him, to the prisoners, the widows, and the orphans who also suffer for freedom. So this shows us that Rizal's love for the Philippines was as real and as deep as his love for his parents, family, and friends.
Jose Rizal accepted that with courage and serenity, seeing it not as an end, but as his ultimate sacrifice for the motherland. In his farewell poem, Mi Ultimo Adios, he expressed willingness to give his life if it meant the awakening of his fellow countrymen, even hoping that his blood would nourish the soil of the Philippines. Despite false charges of rebellion, he chose not to recant his ideals, facing execution in Bagumbayan on December 30, 1896 with dignity. His writings and peaceful advocacy for reform reveal that he embraced martyrdom as part of his mission for truth and freedom. Rizal became an inspiration to fellow Filipinos. Rizal's death became a powerful source of inspiration, awakening a collective spirit of nationalism that fueled the Philippine Revolution. His martyrdom galvanized the movement for independence, proving that sacrifice for one's country could ignite lasting change. Today, his legacy continues to inspire patriotism, integrity, and service to others, as his life and works are remembered every Rizal Day and honored by institutions that uphold his values. His example reminds Filipinos to live with courage, education, and love for the nation.
In his Mi Ultimo Adios, Rizal does not only bid farewell but also leaves behind a message filled with optimism and faith in what lies ahead for the Philippines. Even as he faced death, he looked beyond his own sacrifice and envisioned a brighter tomorrow for his countrymen. This theme, Hope for the Future, reflects his confidence that freedom would eventually be achieved and that perseverance would guide Filipinos towards national independence. For the vision of freedom for the nation, in Mi Ultimo Adios, Rizal expresses his belief that his sacrifice will not be in vain. He envisions a Philippines that will one day rise from colonial oppression and attain freedom. Even in the face of death, Rizal shows optimism, declaring that his blood will serve as nourishment for the seeds of liberty. This reveals his deep faith that future generations of Filipinos will continue the struggle until the vision of national independence becomes reality. For the call of perseverance, along with his vision, Rizal also encourages his fellow Filipinos to persevere. He reminds them that although he will not live to see the dawn of liberty, others will as long as they remain steadfast and united in the fight for justice. His words highlight the importance of courage, resilience, and determination. Through this, Rizal calls on the nation not to lose hope, but to continue the struggle for freedom with unwavering perseverance.
So, in the last verses of the poem, Rizal talks about his faith and spirituality in God. He says, "Where faith does not kill, where the one who reigns is God." This line shows his conviction that true faith comes from God and not from oppressive institutions. He entrusts his soul entirely to God, being confident that divine justice will prevail even if human justice fails. He also asks his countrymen to pray for him, which reflects trust and humility in God's providence. During his final moments, Rizal does not speak of it bitterly. In fact, he bids farewell calmly, saying, "Give thanks that now I rest from the wearisome day." This shows that Rizal saw his death not as meaningless, but as part of a greater divine plan for his country. He also accepts martyrdom with serenity, believing that it will inspire future generations.
The poem's immediate impact was to serve as a powerful farewell and final testament to his countrymen. Smuggled out of his cell, his verses were quickly distributed and recited, igniting a deep sense of shared grief and anger over his impending death. The poem's message of a selfless sacrifice for the nation resonated deeply, transforming Rizal's execution from a political act into a martyrdom for freedom. By showing his unwavering love for the Philippines, even in his final hours, he provided an emotional and spiritual anchor for the revolution. The legacy of Mi Ultimo Adios is its enduring role as a cornerstone of Filipino nationalism. It became an anthem of the revolution, strengthening the resolve of revolutionaries to fight for independence. The poem's beautiful imagery and powerful emotions have made it a staple in Philippine education, where it is studied as a literary masterpiece and a symbol of ultimate patriotism. It cemented Rizal's place as the country's national hero, ensuring his sacrifice will not be forgotten. The poem's message that one's life should be dedicated to their country continues to inspire and serve as a reminder of the price of
I am
freedom.
Ryan Samson and I will be talking about its relevance today. For the inspiration for the love of country, it is said that for a man facing death, Rizal spent his last living hours penning a poem that yearns for a country of potential. It is in the lines, "My dreams were to see you, gem of the sea of the Orient, your dark eyes dry, smooth brow held to a high plane, without frown, without wrinkles and of shame without stain." That we see his lifelong dream was to see a Philippines that did not suffer under the weight of colonization. He sees a Philippines that is proud, with its head held high and looking to the future. In a time where many would see the Philippines as forever a colony to Spain, he lived and died, loving a country that was still to come. On the reflection on sacrifice and civic duty, Rizal opens the poem with gladness. I give you my life. I will still give it to you for your welfare at most, showing his utter devotion to the country. The poem shows the level of sacrifice that Rizal has and would have endured to pursue his dreams of Philippine independence and excellence, regardless of whether the country was under Spanish rule or not. He was a man that acknowledges his desires from a young age to see the improvement of the country, not just for the benefit of himself and his family, but for all Filipinos. For the modern influence, his influence today can be summarized in a quote by Professor Ambeth R. Ocampo: then as now, in life and death, Rizal's writings endure. His works continue to be studied and analyzed, praised and criticized. It is a fact that he reaches out to us through the pages of his books as a constant reminder of the past and a continuing inspiration for the Filipino people. That he was a true revolutionary who sought to use pen and ink as a means of change, and that he was the living soul of the rebellion.
Once again, this has been Group 3 BSN 4C. Thank you so much for watching.